Hello, my name is Andrea Miles, and on behalf of the Stennis Center for Public Service, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our video series on congressional debate. The Stennis Center is a bipartisan legislative branch agency created by Congress in 1988 to promote and strengthen the highest ideals of public service in America. The mission of the Stennis Center is to attract young people to careers in public service, provide training and development opportunities for senior congressional staff, members of Congress, and other public service leaders across the United States. The Stennis Center supports congressional debate because it develops an awareness of the challenges and rewards of public service as students build skills that may someday be applied in a public service career and learn tools to help them participate in civic engagement activities in their communities. This video will teach you advanced tips for congressional debate. These tips will make the difference between good debaters and great debaters. We hope this video series provides you an opportunity to learn more about congressional debate and become a successful participant in student Congress and beyond. For more information on the Stennis Center and congressional debate, please visit our website, www.stennis.gov.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the final video in our Congressional Debate Bootcamp series with the Stennis Center for Public Service. My name is Brett Harvey, and I'm the debate coach here at Mississippi State University.
And I'm Mia Robertson, Speech and Debate Program Assistant at the Stennis Center for Public Service. So by now, you know your way around Student Congress more than 99% of competitors who went to their first tournament, so congratulations on that. And as with most things, the only way to actually become successful at this activity is to actually get in there and do it. And one of the great things about Student Congress is that there are several different ways to be successful.
Yeah, some people are really emotionally powerful speakers, some use humor, some folks are able to summarize everything that's been said in the argument, some people are masters of statistics and data and great researchers. The only way to find out where you sort of fit in and what your strengths are, right, is to get out there and try it. But that said, there are some general principles that everyone can use to improve their performance in congressional debate. And so for the final video in this series, now that we've talked about all the basic parts, from the researching to the speaking to the presiding and the procedures, we want to talk about advanced tips for doing better overall at Student Congress.
The first tip is do no harm. Now, while this may seem obvious, you'd be amazed at how many times we as judges have seen ridiculously, incredibly talented debaters who make it very hard to rank them highly on our score sheets simply because they do things that make the process worse for literally everyone else. So the message here is don't let your desire for a small advantage in the round lead you to make choices that frankly just make you look like a jerk.
Yeah, and let me just tell one anecdote on this. So about a year ago, the two of us were actually judging and serving as parliamentarian in a session of a Congress that was a qualifier to go to nationals. And it was coming down to the very end, and everybody in the session had had a chance to speak but one person, and it was very clear that she wanted to speak on the bill. But there was very little time, and they had to wrap the session up at a very specific time, and they could not go past it. So it was clear there was time for one more person to speak. Well, this person wanted to speak on the other side of the legislation. So one of the things that the presiding officer said was that it was clear that if no one spoke in the affirmation, we could move and have one more negative speech and she could speak. So there was a clear understanding that everyone was expecting don't stand up to speak in affirmation because everyone else in the chamber had had a chance to speak multiple times, right? It was pretty clear where they were going to all end up in the rankings, right? And so he called for affirmative speakers. And nobody raised their placard except for one person. It was a young woman who had already spoken multiple times. She pretty clearly had her trip to nationals already wrapped up, but instead of reading the room and realizing that this other person deserved a chance to speak, she stood up and took the last speech for herself. And frankly, it caused me to rank her much lower, right, on my ranking because she didn't consider other folks in the chamber. She frankly acted like a jerk. In Congress, we're supposed to be considerate of our fellow representatives. It is different than public forum or policy debate or Lincoln Douglas, where sometimes we feel as though we are out to destroy people. And so when somebody plays parliamentary games or acts in a fundamentally disrespectful way or does things where they try to seek out an advantage without being considerate of the chamber, judges can and I would say should and do take that into consideration in their rankings.
Yeah, as Brett said, I was also a judge in that exact same round. And despite the fact that this young lady had spoken, I think 3 times before, she was pretty entertaining to listen to, had given some pretty great speeches. As a result of that one instance, I immediately didn't rank her at all, right? And I think that's the case for a lot of different judges. Just being considerate of the people in the chamber is very, very, very important. So before anything else, don't sabotage an otherwise great performance to get an incredibly small advantage that may not even be that big of a deal in the long run anyway. Don't make the chamber a miserable place simply because you're a part of it, and judges often will and should vote you down because of it.
In other words, don't be a jerk. So tip number 2 is get to know your competition, right? In any kind of a debate or competition, it is always advantageous to try to learn about the people you're going to be going up against. This is why football teams look at film of other teams. This is why Lincoln Douglas debaters look at cases that have been posted online. Now, in congressional debate, getting to know your competitors is arguably even more important, but it works differently, right? Instead of trying to learn their secrets, right, to try to beat them at every turn, you're trying to earn their trust and their respect and to work with them towards certain common goals, even though you are trying to win and win awards, right?
So for example, if you have a piece of legislation that you really want to see get on the docket, you're going to have a lot more success if you know your fellow representatives and you can actually reach out to them to discuss getting that legislation on the docket, right? That representative you're talking to, they might have a piece of legislation they also want on the docket. So you can collaborate and come up with some shared docket. But you can only do that if you know the people around you and have some kind of decorum with them. Along the same vein, if you're interested in running for presiding officer, you're not going to get elected unless you've already earned the trust and the respect of those around you. So it's obviously going to give you a huge advantage if you know your competition and not just that, can earn their respect.
And this is a pretty good approximation of how real legislatures work. Like there's compromise, there's negotiation, there's discussion off the record, and it's an important skill to have, right? Now in many states and leagues, congressional debaters who compete a lot will meet up in group chats and other places to discuss the tournaments that are coming up. Try to find out where those are going on, right? Try to get involved in them. And it should go without saying, if you're generally a friendly, cooperative, nice person and you're sort of a good citizen and you interact with people well, you're going to have a lot easier time getting into these discussions and getting advantages and competition from them.
Now, on the other side of the coin, if you're already in that in-group, it's really important that you be inclusive. The last thing congressional debate needs is small cliques of people who try to hoard all of the opportunity for themselves. So if you see some new competitors or new schools, include them in your conversations, not just in the actual debate round, but also in those preliminary discussions.
Next tip I have is to make sure you have a game plan, right? Now this may seem obvious, right? But you are more likely to be successful in Student Congress if you go into the session with a general outline of what you would like to try to accomplish as a competitor rather than just reacting to what happens around you, right? So for example, try to have a docket that you would like to see approved. Talk with your colleagues about it. If it looks like your docket is not going to get used, then still stay in the discussion and have some backup bills that you've identified that, okay, if I can't get this bill on, here are some other bills that I can certainly live with that I would like to debate. Do you have an amendment that you'd like to offer? If you do, discuss that with folks as soon as you know it's there. Is there one particular bill that you know you're just going to blow it out of the water? You have the greatest speech in the world. Well, if you have a plan of action, you can think, well, maybe on the legislation that comes before this, I don't need to try to give the very last speech, right? Because I want to save my precedence, right? Whatever you do, be thinking strategically about like what's coming next. Don't just stand up and react. Have a game plan going in. Now, to be clear, nobody can predict what's going to happen in a session of Student Congress. Certainly nobody can control it. That's part of what makes it unique and fun. It's collaborative, right? But you can map out your basic goals, your basic strategies, and have a plan of attack when you go in, and that's going to make you more successful overall.
The next tip is that this is a speaking and persuading event first and a debate event second.
Right.
Now, at most tournaments, congressional debate is going to be paired in with the other debate events like Lincoln Douglas Public Forum, Policy, among others. And of course, this does make sense, right? You're debating the specific merits of legislation. You are debating topics that interest you. But as we alluded to earlier, there are key differences between congressional debate and these other forms of debate. The most obvious is that in these other forms of debate, debaters are competing against another person. They're trying to prove a resolution true or false. And the manner in which they do that, they prove or disprove that statement, is really secondary, and in some circuits doesn't matter at all.
But in student Congress, how you get there is really the whole game, right? At the end of a session of student Congress, we don't look at which bills passed and failed. The judge does not sit there and say, well, Mia spoke in favor of 3 bills that passed, but she also spoke against 3 bills that passed, so she has a 3-3 record. That's not how it works. It's not simply about winning and losing on which bills are actually passed into law. They look at how well you spoke, right? They look at how well you interacted with the chamber, whether your questions raised interesting points, whether you were entertaining to listen to. In other words, while events like Lincoln Douglas Public Forum and Policy are about the destination, is the resolution true or false, Congress is much more about the journey and how you get there.
So when you prepare your speeches, you need to make sure you're thinking like a public speaker first and then a debater. And if you've done events like extemporaneous speaking or original oratory, you understand this, right? Humor, credibility, emotion, all of those things come first. And then statistics and data, while incredibly important, are a close second. So don't lose the forest for the trees. Don't get so caught up in attacking a specific narrow point that you completely neglect all of the unique, memorable, emotional, or funny moments that will make the judges remember you whenever they rank you on their scorecard.
Now, that said, to be fair, you still do need to be following the key points in the actual debate in the session, right? Because like we said, although it is a speaking event, the debating part of it is a close second. And if you want to rank high in a strong chamber, it is very important that you show you are engaged in the debate, that you can listen to what people say, synthesize it, and respond to it in real time, because that's the difference between really good competitors and really great competitors. So it becomes very important that you keep up with what is actually being said during the session. Now, there is a technique used in other forms of debate, a specialized note-taking technique that we've talked about in videos, for example, on a YouTube channel that we do, that's called flowing. And this is a way that you keep track of everything that's being said in a debate round.
Now, traditional flowing is probably not the best idea for congressional debate, and that's because the debate does not happen in a linear fashion.
Right.
So Representative A might bring up a point, and then Representative B will speak and not address that point at all. Later on, Representative H might come back and respond to Representative A's point. But you can take the time to make notes on incredibly important points that representatives might make. So for example, arguments about lives lost or dollars saved, some kind of powerful statistic that is really going to stay with the judges and grab their attention. Don't just neglect those things. Write them down. Take notes on them so that you can tackle them head on later. And we talked about how to do this in a previous video. Identify the argument, explain the response, provide the evidence, and tell the impact and weigh those impacts. And always be respectful in the meantime.
And even better than just responding to a single point is the ability maybe to tell a story for the chamber and the judge, right? After a while, the debate is going to become complicated. People are going to be saying all kinds of different things, going off in all kinds of different directions. And some of the very best congressional debaters are the ones who are actually following what's being said and able to weave that into a cohesive narrative for the judge to tell them what they've seen, right?
So first, I want to contextualize this debate around the INF. Half of the senators in this room want to kill that agreement, and the other half seem to think it's already dead. But understand, that sole agreement is protecting both the United States and the globe on a nuclear sector. Senator Cox, that means the diplomacy that you're asking about are moves to save the treaty. Why is that important? Robbie Gramer from Foreign Policy explains in December of 2018 that violating the agreement and building up weapons will destroy any chance we have to save the INF. So for Senator Sukumar, for Senator Cox, and for every other senator in the negation, when you tell us it's time the United States flexes their strength, I could not disagree more.
So for example, you might say something like, Representative Zhang told you X, Y, and Z, but remember what Representative Smith said. He said this, this, and this. And remember what Representative Jones said, this, this, and this. And when you compare those two issues, you see that at the end of the day, the $15 minimum wage is absolutely going to be imperative. In other words, summarizing everything that's being said and sort of putting it together into a nice cohesive whole is one way of showing that you really are engaged, that you're following what's going on, and that you're sort of summing it up for the judge to make their job easier.
That's exactly right. This just tells the judge you are engaged, you're listening to others, and you also have the ability to analyze what they're saying, right? To put it all together on the fly into a story that is persuasive for your judge.
The last tip that I have is that one great question is worth 10 mediocre questions. From the perspective of like a judge or a parliamentarian in student Congress, the questioning process is often hard to follow, and if we're just being totally honest, it's often like very hard to care about. People are jumping out of their seats like they've got the cure for COVID-19, and in truth, they're asking questions that are not particularly memorable or compelling or particularly strong.
And it's understandable why you'd want to do that, right? Everyone wants to ask lots of questions so you can stay at the forefront of the judge's minds. And of course, that's really important, but what's much more important is asking high-quality, memorable questions.
And I will tell you that as somebody who has judged Student Congress on a fairly regular basis, the system that I have for listening to questions is that if something is particularly compelling in terms of a really good question or a really good answer, I will put just a little plus on my score sheet next to the person who either asked it or answered it. And looking back, I will tell you that that plus shows up maybe every 20th question or every 20th answer. And you have to remember, right, in Student Congress, in congressional debate, you are not working at the end of the day to impress your colleagues, the other students. You're working to impress the judge, and if the judge is falling asleep and is not noting what you're saying, then you're really not doing yourself a lot of good.
Really, the ideal situation would be for every time you stand up to ask a question, the chamber and the judges kind of have their ears perk up, because you've been asking quality questions every time you stand up, and while you may not be standing up after every single speech to ask a question, every time you do, it's memorable and it's good quality. Now, we talked earlier about asking these memorable questions, but one of the most important things you have to remember is that you commonly don't have very much time to preface your question, so you need to be planning them with lots of precision. And when we say plan, we actually do mean plan, right? Like, a lot of people will write their question down verbatim just to make sure that when they stand up, they're not stumbling over their words only for the speaker to not understand them and then the PO to move on to someone else.
Right. So how do you craft a good, persuasive, interesting question? Well, a couple of tips. First of all, use plain language and use less of it. Right? Don't try to speak in an elevated tone with really fancy words. This is good advice in all of speech and debate and all of Congress. Simple, straightforward words are your friend. They're better than trying to sound, overcomplicated, right? Secondly, don't just phrase an argument as a rhetorical question. Don't say things like, isn't it true that, and then just make an argument you want to make against somebody, right? At the end of the day, they're not going to agree with you, right? If you think it's strong enough to make as an argument, put it in a speech, right? That's a waste of time.
It's also just kind of a softball, like going off of that. You could be actually asking them a question that puts them on their toes, that throws them off, and instead you're wasting your time to ask them something they're just going to say no to and move on.
Absolutely. It can be a softball, it can be a literal softball in some cases, because sometimes people do the opposite of that, and they get up and ask these sort of don't you agree questions, where they will literally ask someone on the same side of the debate as them an easy question that is basically them reading a statistic or making a point that supports them. That's a waste of the chamber's time. If you think that argument is worth being made, get up, get precedence, and make the argument. Don't throw people softballs. I can tell you that as a judge, if that's all I'm listening to, I would rather the questioning end, right? And we move on and we have another, speech that's hopefully interesting, right? So by this point, hopefully we have shared with you some useful tips that will make you into a better overall congressional debater. It will also make the chamber a better place for having you there. Hopefully we have equipped you to give some persuasive speeches, to prepare efficiently for the tournament, to understand parliamentary procedure, and if you choose, to preside knowledgeably.
More than anything, though, remember to stand early and stand often.
Right.
And also remember that passion beats out perfection. So just the mere fact that you've made it through this series illustrates that you have the passion to be successful in this activity. So channel that into every speech you give and every question you ask.
Again, we want to make sure that we thank the Stennis Center for Public Service for sponsoring this series. They have been great allies of congressional debate and speech and debate generally for many, many years, and this series certainly wouldn't have been possible without them.
So good luck in all of your future congressional debate endeavors, and don't forget, whenever you're giving your speech in the NSDA National Congressional Debate Finals, to shout out the Stennis Center for Public Service.